The stench of rotting garbage was the last thing a man in a $5,000 suit should ever smell. But Lee Jong-jae wasn't thinking about his ruined Italian leather shoes or the blood soaking through his white shirt. He was thinking about survival. The red laser dots dancing across the alley wall above him told him one thing. His own men wanted him dead. I bet you never thought a Korean mafia boss would be hiding in a dumpster, trembling like prey. But when your second-in-command puts a bullet in your ribs and your entire empire turns on you in one bloody night, pride becomes a luxury you can't afford. Jong-jae pressed his palm against the gunshot wound, feeling the warm blood pulse between his fingers. His dragon tattoo, the symbol that once made grown men drop to their knees, was now covered in filth and trash water. The sound of boots on wet pavement grew louder. Voices barked orders in Korean. They were close. Too close. Then the dumpster lid creaked open. Jong-jae's hand flew to his gun, but he froze when he saw her. A black woman in a janitor's uniform stood above him, her face partially hidden in shadow. Her eyes weren't wide with shock or fear. They were calculating, assessing. She looked at his expensive watch, at the gun in his trembling hand, at the growing pool of blood beneath him. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Then she whispered 2 words that would change everything. Follow me. If the idea of a mafia king losing everything in one night and putting his life in the hands of a stranger makes your pulse race, hit that like button right now. This story gets darker and more twisted than you can imagine. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Now, let me tell you how a woman with nothing became the only person a dragon could trust. Jennifer had learned long ago that survival meant staying invisible. As a night shift janitor in the industrial district, she was a ghost, someone people looked through, not at. She emptied trash, mopped floors, and kept her head down. That's how she'd stayed alive in a city where women like her disappeared all the time. But tonight, something made her stop. She'd heard the gunshots 3 blocks away, heard the screech of tires and the shouts of men who sounded like they were hunting. As she pushed her cleaning cart down the alley behind the warehouse, she'd seen the blood trail leading to the dumpster. Every instinct screamed at her to keep walking, to mind her business, to survive another day by being nobody. But Jennifer had been nobody for too long. When she lifted that dumpster lid and saw him, this devastatingly handsome man with death in his hooded eyes and a dragon tattoo crawling up his blood-stained hand, she made a choice. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, not with the arrogance of a man used to power, but with the desperation of someone who just lost everything. Maybe it was because she recognized that look. She'd worn it herself once. "Follow me," she whispered again, her voice barely audible over the rain. Jong-jae stared at her for a heartbeat longer, then nodded. Jennifer didn't ask questions. She guided him through the maze of back alleys she knew by heart, using her janitor's keys to unlock side doors and service entrances. Every shadow felt like it was watching them. Every distant siren made Jong-jae's hand tighten on his gun. But Jennifer moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent years learning how to be invisible in plain sight. When they finally reached her apartment, a tiny studio in a crumbling building that smelled like mildew and fried food, Jong-jae collapsed against her door the moment she locked it behind them. "You're bleeding bad," Jennifer said, already pulling out her first aid kit from under the bathroom sink. It wasn't much. Bandages, antiseptic, needle and thread she'd used to repair her work uniform, but it would have to do. Jong-jae's breathing was shallow, his face pale beneath the blood and grime. He looked up at her with those unreadable eyes. "Why did you help me?" Jennifer met his gaze without flinching. "Because I know what it's like when the whole world wants you dead." She knelt beside him, scissors in hand, and began cutting away his ruined suit. That's when she saw the full extent of the damage, the bullet wound in his side, the cuts and bruises covering his torso, and that massive dragon tattoo that seemed to writhe across his skin even in the dim light. As she pressed a towel against his wound to stop the bleeding, Jong-jae grabbed her wrist. His grip was weak, but his eyes burned with intensity. "They'll kill you for this," he rasped. "If they find out you helped me..." "Then we make sure they don't find out," Jennifer interrupted, pulling her wrist free. "Now shut up and let me work. You die in my apartment, and I'll never get my security deposit back." For the first time in what felt like years, the corner of Jong-jae's mouth twitched, almost like a smile. Jennifer threaded the needle with steady hands, her expression focused. She'd learned to sew from her grandmother, mending clothes because buying new ones was a luxury. She never imagined she'd be using that skill to stitch up a Korean Mafia boss in her living room. "This is going to hurt," she warned. Jong-jae's jaw clenched. "I've had worse." As the needle pierced his skin, Jong-jae didn't scream, didn't even flinch. He just watched Jennifer's face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. There was something ancient in his gaze, something that spoke of violence and power and secrets that could bury cities. But beneath all that, she saw something else, something human, fear, not of death, but of what came after. When she finally tied off the last stitch and bandaged the wound, Jennifer sat back on her heels, exhausted. "You should rest. You've lost a lot of blood." Jong-jae tried to stand, but his legs gave out. Jennifer caught him, surprising herself with her own strength as she guided him to her bed, the only bed in the apartment. "I'll take the couch," she said. "No." His voice was firm despite his weakness. "I won't take your bed." Jennifer looked at this man, this dragon who'd ruled an empire just hours ago, now too weak to argue. "You just did," she said simply, and walked away before he could protest. As she lay on her lumpy couch, listening to Jong-jae's labored breathing from across the room, Jennifer wondered what she'd just done. She'd saved a life tonight, but whose life? A victim or a monster? In the darkness, Jong-jae stared at the cracked ceiling, his hand unconsciously touching the bandages Jennifer had wrapped with such care. He'd built an empire on fear and violence. He'd commanded armies of men. He'd crushed his enemies without mercy. But tonight, a janitor had saved his life. And for the first time in 20 years, Lee Jong-jae didn't know what happened next. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The rain fell like bullets on the Seoul district of the American city, each drop hammering against the pavement with the same relentless rhythm that had defined Lee Jong-jae's heartbeat for the past hour. Running. Always running. 20 minutes ago, he'd been sitting in the back of his armored Mercedes, reviewing contracts for a new shipping venture. The leather seats had smelled of expensive cologne and power. His security detail, 6 men he'd trusted with his life, had surrounded the vehicle in their usual formation. Everything had been normal, routine. Then the first shot shattered his window. Jong-jae could still hear the sound of breaking glass, the wet thud of bullets finding flesh, the screams of men who'd sworn loyalty to him dying in the street. His driver had slumped forward, blood spreading across the dashboard like spilled wine. Through the chaos, Jong-jae had seen him. Director Min, his second in command, his friend of 15 years, standing in the rain with a gun in his hand and a smile on his face. That smile had told Jong-jae everything he needed to know. This wasn't a rival gang. This wasn't an outside attack. This was a coup. His own organization had turned on him. He'd barely managed to escape through the opposite door, his hand instinctively grabbing the emergency weapon hidden beneath the seat. The bullet that caught him in the side had felt like fire, but adrenaline had pushed him forward, into the rain, into the maze of industrial streets he barely recognized. Now, blocks away from the massacre, Jong-jae pressed himself against a brick wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The $5,000 suit that had once commanded respect in boardrooms and underground meetings was torn and soaked with rain and blood. His dragon tattoo, the mark of his authority, inked when he'd taken control of the organization 10 years ago, was visible through his torn sleeve, the coiled serpent seeming to mock him now. "You're no dragon," it seemed to whisper. "You're prey." Voices echoed from the street corner, Korean words sharp and urgent. They were coordinating, spreading out, searching every alley and doorway. Jong-jae recognized the voices. Men who'd eaten at his table, men who'd received bonuses and promotions from his hand. Men who were now hunting him like an animal. His side throbbed with each heartbeat, blood seeping through his fingers despite the pressure he applied. He needed to hide, needed to think, needed to understand how his entire world had collapsed in the span of minutes. The alley stretched before him, narrow and dark, lined with dumpsters and industrial waste. Rain cascaded from broken gutters, creating rivers of filth that swirled around his ruined Italian leather shoes. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of trucks, the hum of the city that never slept, oblivious to the fact that one of its underground kings was bleeding out in its forgotten corners. Red laser sights danced across the wall above his head. Jong-jae's training took over. He dropped low, his body moving on instinct, even as pain screamed through his torso. The dumpster beside him reeked of rot and decay, but survival didn't care about dignity. He yanked open the heavy lid, the screech of metal on metal making him wince, and pulled himself inside. The stench was overwhelming. Garbage bags split open, spilling their contents around him. Something wet and unidentifiable soaked through what remained of his shirt. Jong Jae pressed himself against the filthy interior, his gun clutched in one hand, his other still trying to stem the bleeding from his wound. Through the crack in the lid, he could see flashlight beams cutting through the rain. Footsteps splashed closer. Men speaking in rapid Korean, their voices tight with urgency. They were checking every possible hiding spot, every shadow, every corner. Jong Jae's finger moved to the trigger of his gun. If they found him, he'd take at least 2 with him before the end. It wasn't much consolation for a man who'd once controlled an empire, but it was something. The footsteps stopped directly beside the dumpster. His heart hammered so loudly he was certain they could hear it. Every muscle in his body tensed, ready for the lid to fly open, ready for the final confrontation. The beam of a flashlight swept across the dumpster's exterior, pausing, considering. Then a voice called out from down the alley. They'd found a blood trail leading in another direction. The footsteps moved away, splashing through puddles, chasing a ghost. Jong Jae didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare believe he was safe. Minutes passed like hours. The rain continued its relentless assault on the city, washing away evidence, obscuring trails, erasing his existence one drop at a time. His vision began to blur. The blood loss was catching up to him, dragging him down into darkness. This was how it ended, then. Not in a blaze of glory, not in a final stand worthy of the stories his men used to tell, but alone, in a trash can, in a city that would forget his name before morning. The lid of the dumpster creaked open. Jong Jae's gun came up instantly, his arm shaking from blood loss, but his aim still steady. His finger tightened on the trigger as his eyes adjusted to the sudden intrusion of streetlight. A woman stood above him. She wasn't one of his assassins. She wore a janitor's uniform, the kind of shapeless, practical clothing that made people invisible in the urban landscape. Her skin was dark, her features sharp and intelligent. In one hand, she held a flashlight. In the other, a set of keys that marked her as someone who belonged in these forgotten spaces. Their eyes met. Jong Jae saw her gaze travel over him, the expensive watch on his wrist, the gun in his hand, the blood spreading across his torso, the dragon tattoo that identified him as someone dangerous. He waited for her to scream, to run, to call for help. That's what any sensible person would do. Instead, she simply assessed him like she was cataloging inventory. A man, injured, armed, desperate. 3 seconds of silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of rain and Jong Jae's labored breathing. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear and calm. "Follow me." Jong Jae stared at her, his mind struggling to process what was happening. This woman, this stranger, was offering him help. Why? What did she gain from harboring a wounded man covered in blood and filth? Every instinct screamed that it was a trap, that she was working with his enemies, that this was just another layer of the betrayal. But her eyes held no deceit, only a strange, steady certainty. "They're coming back," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "You have maybe 2 minutes before they widen their search pattern. You can trust me, or you can die in that dumpster. Your choice." The pragmatism in her voice decided it for him. Jong Jae holstered his gun and used what remained of his strength to pull himself from the dumpster. His legs nearly buckled when his feet hit the pavement, but the woman was there, her arms surprisingly strong as she steadied him. "Can you walk?" she asked. "I don't have a choice," Jong Jae managed through gritted teeth. She nodded, as if his answer confirmed something she'd already suspected about him. "Stay close. Don't talk. If anyone sees us, you're my cousin who had too much to drink, understand?" Jong Jae nodded. Jennifer, though he didn't know her name yet, moved with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of this neighborhood. She guided him through a series of back alleys that seemed to exist in the city's blind spots, places where security cameras didn't reach and decent people didn't venture after dark. Every step sent fresh waves of pain through Jong Jae's body, but he forced himself to keep moving. The woman adjusted her pace to match his, never rushing, never showing impatience, just maintaining a steady rhythm that kept them moving forward. Quick pause. Take 1 second and subscribe and M keys. Also, tell me in the comments section what you think will happen next. Also, tell us where you are watching from, remember. They passed a group of men huddled under an awning, sharing cigarettes and speaking in Spanish. The woman nodded to them casually, and they nodded back, barely glancing at Zhang Jie. To them, he was just another drunk being helped home. Nothing worth remembering. Zhang Jie had spent years being the most important person in every room he entered. Now, he was learning what it meant to be invisible. The apartment building appeared ahead, a structure that had seen better decades. Graffiti covered the lower walls, and several windows on the upper floors were boarded up. It was the kind of place his organization owned dozens of, collecting rent from people who had nowhere else to go. The irony wasn't lost on him. Jennifer pulled out her keys and led him to a side entrance, partially hidden behind an industrial air conditioning unit. Service entrance, she explained quietly. No cameras in this section. Building's too cheap to cover everything. She knew the blind spots. Zhang Jie filed that information away, his strategic mind still working even through the haze of pain and blood loss. Inside, the hallway smelled of cooking spices and mildew. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. Jennifer moved quickly now, her hand on his elbow, guiding him up a stairwell that groaned under their weight. "Elevator's broken," she whispered. "Has been for 3 months. Management keeps promising to fix it." 3 flights of stairs felt like climbing a mountain. Zhang Jie's vision swam with each step, black spots dancing at the edges. Only Jennifer's steady grip kept him upright. She supported more of his weight with each floor, her breathing controlled, and even while his came in desperate gasps. Finally, they reached a door marked 3F. Jennifer unlocked it quickly, ushered him inside, and immediately locked it behind them. The apartment was small, tiny actually. A single room that served as bedroom, living room, and kitchen all at once, with a bathroom barely larger than a closet visible through an open door. The furniture was worn but clean, the kind of pieces people rescued from curbs and refurbished. A small bookshelf held paperbacks with creased spines. A single window overlooked the alley below, covered with a thin curtain that had been washed so many times the pattern had faded to ghosts. It was the opposite of everything Zhang Jie had known for the past 15 years. "Sit," Jennifer commanded, pulling out one of 2 mismatched chairs at a small table. Zhang Jie collapsed into it, his body finally giving up the fight now that he was somewhere relatively safe. If you're enjoying this story, like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Your support means everything. Zhang Jie sank onto the mattress, every muscle in his body finally relaxing now that it understood it was safe to do so. The sheets smelled like lavender laundry detergent, clean and simple. "I'll take the couch," Jennifer said, turning away. "No." The word came out more forcefully than Zhang Jie intended. "I won't take your bed." Jennifer looked back at him, one eyebrow raised. "You're in no condition to argue. I've slept in worse places than a couch. I'm sure you have, but right now you need proper rest, not whatever tough guy nonsense you're about to suggest." She grabbed a pillow and a spare blanket from a small closet. "Besides, that couch is more comfortable than it looks. I've spent plenty of nights on it." Zhang Jie wanted to argue further, but his body was already sinking into the mattress, accepting defeat. "This is your home. I'm the intruder." "You're a guest," Jennifer corrected, settling onto the small couch across the room. "There's a difference. A guest who might get you terminated. Let me worry about that." She pulled the blanket over herself, her body fitting on the couch in a way that suggested long practice. "Right now, you need to sleep. We can figure out what comes next in the morning." Zhang Jie lay back against the pillow, staring at the cracked ceiling above him. Water stains formed abstract patterns in the plaster, maps of damage and neglect. In his penthouse apartment across the city, if it even still existed, if his enemies hadn't already seized it, the ceiling was pristine white, unmarked perfect. But that perfection had been a lie. This ceiling, with all its flaws visible, felt more honest. "Thank you," he said quietly, not sure if Jennifer was still awake. From the couch came her response, soft but clear. "You're welcome." Silence settled over the apartment, broken only by the distant sounds of the city and the rhythm of rain against the window. Zhang Jie closed his eyes, expecting his mind to race with plans and strategies and calculations about what had happened and what needed to happen next. Instead, exhaustion claimed him almost immediately, pulling him down into a darkness that, for the first time in years, felt safe. On the couch, Jennifer lay awake, staring at the ceiling she knew by heart. She'd counted those cracks 1,000 times on sleepless nights, traced those water stains with her eyes until they were as familiar as constellations. Tonight, they seemed different somehow, changed by the presence of a stranger in her bed. A dangerous stranger, her rational mind reminded her. A man who carried a gun and wore expensive clothes and had a dragon tattoo that marked him as someone involved in things she was better off not knowing about. But also a man who'd thanked her, who'd tried to give her back her own bed despite being half dead, who'd looked at her not with the dismissive glance she was used to receiving in her janitor's uniform, but with genuine attention. Jennifer turned onto her side, punching the pillow into a more comfortable shape. She'd made her choice when she opened that dumpster lid. Now she had to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. In the bed across the room, Jong-jae's breathing had evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep. In rest, his face lost some of its hardness, becoming almost vulnerable. The dragon tattoo on his hand, visible where it rested on top of the blanket, seemed less threatening in the dim light filtering through the curtains. Tomorrow, Jennifer knew, would bring complications, questions, possibly danger. But tonight, she'd saved a life, and in a world that took so much from people like her, being able to give something back, even to a stranger, even to someone dangerous, felt like a small victory. She closed her eyes and let sleep find her, the sound of rain on the window, a familiar lullaby in the city that never truly slept. Morning came with the harsh sound of a television news anchor's voice cutting through the apartment's thin walls. Jong-jae woke instantly, his hand reaching for a gun that wasn't there before his brain caught up to his instincts. Pain flared through his side, reminding him of everything that had happened. Jennifer was already awake, sitting on the edge of the couch with a cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the small television perched on a milk crate across the room. The morning light streaming through the window caught the exhaustion on her face. She clearly hadn't slept well. "You should see this," she said without looking at him. Jong-jae pulled himself upright, biting back a groan as his stitched wound protested the movement. On the screen, footage showed the aftermath of last night's attack. The intersection where his convoy had been ambushed was cordoned off with police tape. Body bags were being loaded into ambulances. The reporter's voice was grave and dramatic. 7 people are confirmed deceased in what police are calling a targeted attack on the Korean business district. Sources close to the investigation suggest this may be related to organized criminal activity, though officials are not commenting on specifics. Among the deceased is believed to be prominent businessman Lee Jong-jae, though bodies have not yet been formally identified. The screen cut to footage of director Min standing behind a podium with appropriate somber expressions. "We are devastated by this tragic loss. Mr. Lee was a respected member of our community, a generous benefactor, and a visionary leader. His death leaves a void that will be impossible to fill." Jong-jae's jaw clenched so hard, Jennifer could hear his teeth grind from across the room. The news continued with speculation about gang warfare and territorial disputes, painting a picture of violence that the city's upstanding citizens should be concerned about. Then it moved on to weather forecasts and traffic reports, as if 7 lives, his life, were just another story to fill the morning broadcast. "They think you're dead," Jennifer said, finally looking at him. "Is that good or bad?" Jong-jae was silent for a long moment, his mind working through the implications. "It gives me time," he finally said. "They'll be scrambling to consolidate power, to divide up territories, to eliminate potential rivals. If they think I'm gone, they won't be looking for me. But eventually they'll find out you survived." Eventually. Jong-jae swung his legs off the bed, testing his strength. The room tilted slightly, but he remained upright. "By then, I'll be ready." Jennifer set down her coffee cup. "Ready for what? Revenge? Taking back what's yours?" "Both. And in the meantime, you're planning to hide here? In my apartment?" The question hung in the air between them. Jong-jae heard the concern beneath it. Not for herself, he realized, but for him. She was wondering if he had a plan beyond immediate survival. The truth was, he didn't. For the first time in 15 years, Lee Jong-jae had no empire, no resources, no army of men at his command. He was a ghost in a city that thought he was dead, wounded and dependent on the charity of a woman he'd met 12 hours ago. The realization should have been humiliating, Instead, it was oddly clarifying. I need to stay invisible, he said, at least for now. Can you teach me how to do that? Jennifer blinked, clearly surprised by the question. Teach you to be invisible? You live in this city without being seen. You move through spaces that people like me. He gestured at the expensive watch still on his wrist, incongruous against the bandages and borrowed circumstances. People like me never notice. You understand how to exist without drawing attention. I need to learn that. Jennifer studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was serious or simply concussed. Finally, she stood and walked to her tiny kitchen area. First lesson, she said, pulling out bread and eggs. Invisible people don't wear $1,000 watches or have manicured hands. If you're going to be nobody, you need to look like nobody. She was right. Jong Jae looked down at himself. The dragon tattoo, the designer watch, even the way he carried himself spoke of power and privilege. All of it would have to go. I'll need different clothes, he said. I have some things that might fit. Left behind by... Jennifer paused, something flickering across her face too quickly for Jong Jae to read. By someone who used to live here. They're not fancy, but they'll be less conspicuous than a blood-soaked designer suit. While Jennifer cooked breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, simple but filling, Jong Jae removed his watch and set it on the small table. Without it, his wrist looked pale and vulnerable, marked by a tan line that traced where luxury had sat for years. The tattoo is a problem, Jennifer observed, sliding a plate in front of him. A dragon that size is memorable. People will notice it. I'll keep it covered. They ate in silence, the morning news still murmuring in the background with stories about traffic accidents and political scandals and the weather forecast promising more rain. Normal life, continuing despite the fact that Jong Jae's entire world had ended last night. Jennifer watched him eat with an intensity that made him self-conscious. When he raised an eyebrow in question, she shook her head. You eat like you're expecting someone to take it away, she said, like you're in a hurry. Jong Jae set down his fork, realizing she was right. He'd been shoveling food without tasting it, driven by pure survival instinct. Old habits, he said, from before. Before you were a powerful businessman? There was no judgment in her voice, just curiosity. Before I was anything. Jong Jae looked at the simple plate of eggs and toast. I grew up hungry, really hungry. The kind where you don't know if there will be food tomorrow, so you eat everything today while you can. Even after I had enough, after I had more than enough, I never lost that feeling. Jennifer nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. I know that feeling. My mama used to say that hunger leaves a mark on you even after your stomach is full. It stays in your bones, reminds you that security is temporary. It was the first real piece of information she'd shared about herself, and Jong Jae filed it away. This woman understood scarcity, understood what it meant to build a life on uncertain foundations. But hunger doesn't have to define you, Jennifer continued, her voice taking on an edge. You can acknowledge where you came from without letting it control how you move through the world. You can take up space without apologizing for it. Jong Jae frowned. Taking up space makes you visible. You just said, I need to be invisible. There's a difference between being invisible by choice and being invisible because the world doesn't see you as worthy of being seen. Jennifer stood, collecting their empty plates with decisive movements. I choose to be invisible at work because it keeps me safe. But here in my own home, I take up space. I exist fully. You need to learn the difference. It was a rebuke, gentle but firm. Jong Jae realized he'd been treating her apartment like a temporary hiding spot, a utility to be used until he could return to his real life. But this wasn't a safe house or a strategic position. This was Jennifer's home, the space she'd carved out for herself in a city that tried to grind people like her into dust. I apologize, he said. You're right. I've been thinking like I'm just passing through. Aren't you? The question was direct, demanding honesty. Jong Jae met her gaze. I don't know. Yesterday I would have said yes without hesitation. Today, he gestured at the modest apartment, at the simple breakfast, at the entire life he'd never imagined living. Today, I don't know what comes next. Jennifer softened slightly. That's honest, at least. Most people in your position would already be planning their dramatic comeback, thinking about revenge and restoration. But you can't rebuild an empire from my couch. First, you have to survive, and survival means adapting. She was right. Jong Jae had built his organization through adaptation, through understanding when to advance and when to retreat, when to be the dragon and when to be the shadow. But somewhere along the way, surrounded by luxury and power, he'd forgotten that flexibility. "Teach me," he said again, "how to adapt, how to survive in this world." Jennifer considered him for a moment, then nodded. "First rule, make yourself useful. People who are useful get to stay. People who are burdens get removed." Over the next hour, Jennifer showed him how to clean the apartment properly. Not the surface-level tidying that hired staff did in his penthouse, but the deep, thorough cleaning that came from truly caring for a space. She demonstrated how to wash dishes efficiently in the tiny sink, how to sweep the worn floors without raising dust, how to fold clothes so they fit in limited storage. Jong Jae, who had commanded millions in business dealings, who had negotiated treaties between rival factions, who had built an empire from nothing, learned how to scrub a toilet. It should have been degrading. Instead, it was strangely meditative. "You're a quick learner," Jennifer observed, watching him wipe down the kitchen counter with actual competence. "Most people from your world wouldn't even try." "Most people from my world would already be dead," Jong Jae replied. "Pride is a luxury I can't afford right now." Jennifer's expression shifted into something that might have been approval. "That's the smartest thing I've heard you say." While Jennifer got ready for her shift, she had to work, she explained, or risk losing the job that paid for this apartment. Jong Jae continued cleaning. Not because she'd asked him to, but because it gave him something to do besides think about betrayal and revenge and all the ways his carefully constructed world had crumbled. He was reorganizing the small closet, trying to create more efficient storage, when his hand brushed against something tucked behind the winter coats. A small notebook, worn and creased, with pages that had been handled countless times. Jong Jae pulled it out, intending to just move it to a better location. But the page it fell open to caught his attention. It was a ledger. Handwritten entries tracking amounts and dates and names. His eyes, trained to read financial documents quickly, scanned the columns with growing comprehension. These weren't Jennifer's debts, they were her family's. Her mother had borrowed money 3 years ago for medical treatment. Her younger brother had taken a loan for education. Small amounts by Jong Jae's standards, but crippling for someone working minimum wage. And the lender's name, written at the top of each page in careful script, Lotus Enterprises, his organization, the empire he'd built. Jong Jae's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, seeing the compounding interest, the penalties for late payments, the way the debt had grown like a cancer until it consumed everything. There were notes in the margins. Jennifer's handwriting, he recognized it now, calculating how many extra shifts she'd need to work, which bills could be paid late, desperate mathematics trying to keep her family afloat. The dates on the most recent entries were from last month. The debt was still active, still growing. "What are you doing?" Jennifer's voice was sharp, startling him. She stood in the doorway, half-dressed for work, her expression hardening as she saw what he held. "That's private," she said, moving forward to snatch the notebook from his hands. Jong Jae let her take it, but didn't look away from her face. "Lotus Enterprises. That's my organization." Before we continue, hit the subscribe button, like this video, and drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far this story has reached. Jennifer's jaw tightened. "Your organization that charges 30% interest and threatens to break legs if payments are late. Your organization that my mother went to when the hospital wouldn't treat her without money up front. Your organization that's been bleeding my family dry for 3 years." The accusations hung in the air between them like smoke. Jong Jae felt something twist in his chest. Not quite guilt, because he hadn't personally approved these loans, hadn't set these interest rates, hadn't made these specific threats, but he'd created the system that allowed it to happen. He'd built an empire on the backs of people exactly like Jennifer's family. "I didn't know," he said, and immediately realized how inadequate that sounded. "Of course you didn't know." Jennifer's voice was bitter now, all the warmth from earlier conversations gone. "People like you never know. You sit in your expensive offices and count your profits and never think about where that money actually comes from. Never think about the mothers working 3 jobs, the kids who can't afford school, the families choosing between medicine and food." She shoved the notebook into her bag with shaking hands. "I knew what you were when I pulled you out of that dumpster. I saw the watch, the suit, the tattoo. I knew you were probably someone who'd hurt people like me, but you were bleeding and scared and human, and I thought—" She stopped, shaking her head. "I don't know what I thought." Jong Jae stood slowly, his wound protesting, but his mind clear. "You thought I was worth saving despite what I was. You thought I could be more than my worst actions. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe." Jong Jae moved carefully toward her, mindful not to crowd her space. "Or maybe you saw something true. I built an empire on violence and exploitation. I knew the business model required crushing people who couldn't fight back. I told myself it was just business, that someone else would do it if I didn't, that the world was brutal, and I was just being realistic." He gestured at the apartment, at the life she'd built despite everything working against her. "But you saved my life. You gave me your bed, your food, your safety. You did that knowing I was dangerous, knowing I was probably someone who'd profited from pain. And you did it anyway because you saw a human being who needed help." Jennifer's expression didn't soften, but she didn't turn away either. "I can't undo 3 years of debt," Jong Jae continued. "I can't erase the system I built or bring back the time your mother needed treatment or the opportunities your brother lost. But I can tell you this. If I survive, if I get back any portion of what I lost, that debt is cleared. Your family's name gets erased from every ledger in every company I controlled. And the interest rates, the penalties, all of it, I'll burn it down." "Empty promises from a man who might not live to see next week," Jennifer said, but there was less heat in her voice now. "Then let me be useful while I'm here." Jong Jae met her eyes directly. "You said useful people get to stay. Let me help you. Not as the person I was, but as the person I could be." For a long moment, Jennifer just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed, the tension draining from her shoulders. "I have to go to work," she said finally. "There's leftover rice in the refrigerator and canned soup in the cabinet. Don't answer the door. Don't go outside. Don't do anything stupid. Understood." She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the knob. "That debt? It's not why I helped you. I didn't even know you were connected to Lotus until just now. I helped you because it was the right thing to do, regardless of who you were or what you'd done." "I know," Jong Jae said quietly. "Good. Because when this is over, when you go back to being whoever you're going to be, I need you to remember that people like my mother exist, that every decision you make in your fancy office affects someone's real life. Can you do that?" Jong Jae thought about the ledger, about the careful handwriting tracking impossible mathematics, about the system he'd created that turned human suffering into profit margins. "Yes," he said, "I can do that." Jennifer nodded once, sharp and final, then left for work. Alone in the apartment, Jong Jae returned to the closet where he'd found the ledger. He pulled out the notebook again, even though Jennifer had taken the original with her. She'd hidden it because it was important, because it represented her family's struggle, because it was private pain made tangible. But he'd seen enough to understand. The debt was with Lotus Enterprises, but more specifically, it was under the jurisdiction of Director Min's division. The same Director Min who'd orchestrated last night's coup. The same man who'd smiled as Jong Jae's security detail died. This wasn't just about power anymore. It wasn't just about betrayal and revenge and taking back what was his. Jennifer's family was caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't even know existed, and countless other families just like hers, trapped in the machinery of an empire built on their suffering. Jong Jae sat down on the couch, feeling the weight of revelations he'd been too insulated to see before. He'd known intellectually that his business model hurt people, but knowing something abstractly and seeing the specific damage, seeing Jennifer's neat handwriting, calculating impossible choices, those were very different things. For years, he'd told himself that he was better than common criminals because he operated with rules, with structure, with a code. But what good was a code that left families drowning in debt? What honor was there in a system that forced people to choose between survival and dignity? The television continued its endless cycle of news and commercials and cooking shows, the background noise of a world that kept turning, regardless of personal catastrophes. Jong Jae watched without really seeing, his mind turning over problems that suddenly seemed more complex than simple revenge. If he reclaimed his empire, would he just perpetuate the same system? Would he go back to being the person who approved interest rates and collection policies without thinking about the Jennifers of the world? Or would this experience, being powerless, being dependent, being invisible, change him fundamentally? He didn't know. And that uncertainty was perhaps the most unsettling revelation of all. Outside, the city hummed with life. Somewhere out there, Director Min was consolidating power, eliminating rivals, building his own version of the empire. Somewhere out there, Jennifer was mopping floors and emptying trash cans, invisible to the people whose messes she cleaned up. And somewhere out there, countless families were making impossible choices because men like him had built systems that required their suffering. Zhang Jie pulled the borrowed clothes closer around himself, worn jeans and a faded t-shirt that made him look like anyone, like no one, like a person the world could ignore. For now, that was exactly what he needed to be. But eventually, he would have to decide who he became when he stopped being invisible. When he had power again, if he had power again, what would he do with it? The question sat heavy in his chest as the morning stretched toward afternoon, as the sunlight moved across the worn floor of Jennifer's apartment, as the city continued its relentless rhythm of survival and struggle outside the thin walls. For the first time in 15 years, Li Zhongjie didn't have an answer. And maybe, he thought, sitting in the silence of a stranger's kindness, that was exactly what he needed. 3 days passed in careful routine. Zhongjie learned the rhythm of Jennifer's life, when she left for work, when she returned exhausted, how she stretched her modest groceries across the week. He made himself useful, cleaning and organizing, preparing simple meals when she came home too tired to cook. They existed in a strange bubble of domesticity, two people from different worlds sharing space and slowly, carefully learning to trust each other. On the fourth day, the bubble shattered. Jennifer was at work when the knock came. Not the polite tap of a neighbor, but the deliberate, authoritative knock of someone who expected the door to be opened. Zhang Jie moved silently to the window, peering through a gap in the curtain. 3 black SUVs were parked below. Men in dark suits stood at various points around the building, their positions tactical and precise. This wasn't a random visit. They'd found him. Zhang Jie's hand moved to where his gun should have been, then remembered he'd lost it during the escape. He was unarmed, wounded, trapped in a third-floor apartment with one exit. Every tactical training he'd ever received screamed him to run, to fight, to do something. The knock came again, harder this time. "Mr. Li," a familiar voice called through the door. "I know you're in there. We've been watching the building for 2 days. I saw the janitor bring you here. Very clever, hiding with the help. But the game is over now." Director Min Zhongjie's jaw clenched. He could try to escape through the window, but the drop would likely finish what the bullet wound had started. He could barricade himself inside, but that would only delay the inevitable. Or he could face this directly, on his own terms. He opened the door. Director Min stood in the hallway, flanked by 2 armed men. He looked exactly as Zhang Jie remembered. Polished suit, carefully styled hair, the appearance of respectability masking calculated ruthlessness. His smile was practiced and cold. "There you are," Min said pleasantly, as if they were meeting for lunch rather than a confrontation. "You look terrible, by the way. Poverty doesn't suit you." "What do you want, Min?" "What I've always wanted. Control, power, the empire you've been hoarding for yourself." Min stepped into the apartment uninvited, his eyes scanning the modest space with obvious disdain. "I must say, I'm disappointed. When you disappeared, I thought you'd gone to ground somewhere strategic. A safe house, perhaps, or one of your offshore properties. But this?" He gestured around the tiny apartment. "This is just sad." Zhang Jie remained still, calculating angles and distances, looking for any advantage. "How did you find me?" "Please. You think a man covered in blood, stumbling through the industrial district at midnight, goes unnoticed? We have cameras everywhere, informants on every corner. It just took time to track your path." Min's smile widened. "And then we waited to see if you'd make contact with anyone, if you'd try to rebuild. But you've just been playing house with a janitor. How domestic." The casual cruelty in Min's voice made Zhang Jie's hands curl into fists. "This doesn't concern her. She's innocent in all of this." "Innocent?" Min laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Nobody is innocent, Zhang Jie. That janitor of yours? She knew exactly who you were. She made a choice to help you, which makes her complicit. And more importantly, it makes her useful." The implications settled like lead in Zhang Jie's stomach. "Don't. Too late." Min checked his watch with exaggerated casualness. Right about now, my men are picking her up from her workplace. She'll be brought to a location I'll share with you shortly. You can exchange yourself for her. The dragon for the stray. Poetic, don't you think? Rage, white-hot and consuming, flooded through Zhang Jie. But years of discipline kept his voice level. She has nothing to do with our business. She has everything to do with it the moment she chose to shield you. Min turned toward the door, then paused. You have 6 hours. Come alone, unarmed, ready to accept consequences. Or don't come, and I'll make sure her family's debt becomes exponentially worse before I remove the problem entirely. Your choice. He left, his guards following, their footsteps echoing down the stairwell like a countdown. Zhang Jie stood frozen for exactly 10 seconds. Then training and instinct took over. He moved through the apartment rapidly, gathering anything that might be useful. Jennifer's phone, he'd memorized the password from watching her unlock it. The emergency cash she kept hidden in a coffee can. The small knife she used for cooking. He was pulling on his jacket when he saw it. The debt ledger, sitting on the small table where Jennifer had left it that morning. Physical evidence of her family's obligation to his organization. Proof that could be used to justify anything Min wanted to do to her. Zhang Jie picked up the notebook, his thumb rubbing across the worn cover. Then he walked to the stove, turned on the gas burner, and held the ledger to the flame. The pages caught quickly, curling and blackening, years of financial burden turning to ash. He watched it burn completely, then scattered the ashes in the sink and washed them down the drain. No evidence, no leverage, no chain binding Jennifer's family to his empire. It was a small gesture, probably meaningless in the larger scheme of things, but it felt necessary. Jennifer had given him sanctuary when he had nothing. The least he could do was remove one burden from her shoulders. Now he needed to save her life. Zhang Jie left the apartment, moving through the building's blind spots that Jennifer had taught him about. The men watching the building were looking for someone trying to sneak in, not someone leaving openly. He walked out the front entrance like he belonged there, just another invisible person in a city full of them. He had 6 hours and no resources. But he had knowledge of his organization's operations, of Min's patterns, of the city's hidden infrastructure. And he had motivation sharper than any weapon. They wanted the dragon, he'd give them the dragon. The hours that followed were a blur of careful planning and calculated risks. Zhang Jie used Jennifer's phone to access old contacts, people who owed him favors, people who hadn't yet declared loyalty to Min's regime. He called in debts and made promises, building a network from nothing. By the time Min's message arrived with a location, the old shipping warehouse on Pier 47, Zhang Jie had assembled something resembling a plan. It wasn't much. It probably wouldn't work, but it was all he had. The warehouse was exactly the kind of place Min would choose. Isolated, controlled, with multiple exits for him and his men, but effectively a trap for anyone else. Zhang Jie approached carefully, using the maintenance tunnels Jennifer had mentioned during one of their conversations. The city's invisible infrastructure, the passages that janitors and workers used, the routes that powerful men never noticed. He emerged inside the warehouse to find exactly what he expected. Jennifer was bound to a chair in the center of the space, unharmed, but clearly frightened. Min stood nearby with a dozen armed men positioned around the perimeter. Overhead lights cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor. Punctual as always, Min called out when he spotted Zhang Jie. I appreciate that about you. Even in defeat, you maintain certain standards. Zhang Jie walked forward slowly, hands visible and empty. His eyes met Jennifer's briefly, trying to convey reassurance he didn't feel. She looked terrified but unbroken, her jaw set with the same determination he'd seen when she'd first opened that dumpster lid. Let her go, Zhang Jie said. This is between us. Oh, I don't think so. Min circled Jennifer's chair like a predator. See, I've been thinking about this. You taught me that power isn't just about strength, it's about symbols. And this woman, she represents everything you've become. Weak, sentimental, human. He placed his hand on Jennifer's shoulder, and Zhang Jie saw her flinch. She's cheese in the trap, Zhang Jie. Bait to draw out the supposedly fearsome Iron Lotus. And you came, just like I knew you would, because you've gone soft. If this story is already touching you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your country or city. I want to know where you're watching from. If you harm her, you'll what? You have no organization, no weapons, no leverage. You're nobody now. Just a man pretending he still matters. Min's smile was triumphant. But I'm feeling generous. I'll give you a choice. Kneel, acknowledge me as the rightful leader of what was yours, and I'll let the woman go free. Your pride for her life. That seems fair. Jong-jae looked at Jennifer, really looked at her. She was shaking her head slightly, trying to tell him not to do it, not to give in. This woman who'd saved his life, who'd shared her home and her food, who'd shown him what it meant to have value beyond power, she was telling him to save himself instead of her. And in that moment, Jong-jae understood something fundamental. Min was wrong. Jong-jae hadn't become weak by caring about Jennifer. He'd become stronger. Real strength wasn't about dominating others. It was about protecting what mattered. Real power wasn't about making people fear you. It was about earning their trust. No, Jong-jae said simply. Min's expression darkened. No? Jennifer isn't bait. She isn't a bargaining chip. She isn't something to be traded or threatened or used. Jong-jae's voice was steady, certain. She's shielded, not kept, under my protection, not my possession, and that means I don't negotiate with her life. Then you're a bigger fool than I thought. Min drew his gun, pressing it against Jennifer's temple. Last chance, Jong-jae. Kneel or she dies. If you pull that trigger, Jong-jae said quietly, you'll never leave this warehouse alive. Min laughed. With what army? You're alone and unarmed. Am I? The question hung in the air for a heartbeat. Then the warehouse's overhead doors began to open, the screech of metal on metal echoing through the space. Figures emerged from the shadows, not an army, but enough. Workers from the shipping yard, people Jong-jae had contacted during those 6 hours. People who'd been exploited by the organization, who'd lost family to its violence, who were tired of being invisible. And leading them was someone Jong-jae had never expected to see again. His younger lieutenant, Park, who was supposed to have died in the initial coup. Wounded but alive, his arm in a sling, but his weapon steady. Sorry I'm late, boss, Park said. Turns out, being left for dead gives you time to think about loyalty. Min's confidence flickered for the first time. His men shifted nervously, suddenly aware they were outnumbered by people who had nothing left to lose. Shoot them all, Min ordered, his voice sharp with panic. But his men hesitated. The warehouse had become a standoff, and nobody wanted to be the first to start a firefight they might not survive. In that moment of hesitation, Jennifer moved. Despite being bound to the chair, she threw her weight backward, toppling herself away from Min's gun. The sudden movement startled him, and his shot went wide, the bullet sparking off concrete. Chaos erupted. Park and the others rushed forward as Min's men scattered, some trying to fight, others running for exits. Jong-jae lunged for Jennifer, sliding across the floor to shield her body with his own as gunfire erupted overhead. Are you hurt? He asked urgently, working at the ropes binding her wrists. I'm fine, Jennifer gasped. Behind you. Jong-jae turned to see one of Min's guards raising a weapon. Before he could react, Jennifer grabbed the small knife from Jong-jae's pocket, the cooking knife she'd sharpened every week, and threw it with surprising accuracy. It struck the guard's gun hand, and the weapon clattered away. My grandmother also taught me to throw knives, Jennifer said breathlessly, for protection. Jong-jae stared at her with something like wonder, then pulled her behind a concrete pillar as more bullets ricocheted around them. The warehouse had become a war zone, and they were trapped in the middle of it. There, Jennifer pointed to a set of metal stairs leading to an upper control room. We can get out through the crane operator's platform. It connects to the adjacent building. How do you know that? I used to work here, before the janitorial job. I know every exit in this place. They ran for the stairs, keeping low as the firefight continued around them. The control room was small and dusty, filled with panels and levers controlling the massive cranes used to move shipping containers. Through the windows, Jong-jae could see Min trying to rally his remaining men, his face twisted with rage. He's going to kill everyone here if we don't stop him, Jennifer said, watching the chaos below. We need to get you to safety first. No. Jennifer's voice was firm. I'm tired of running. Tired of being invisible, tired of letting people like him decide who gets to take up space in this world. She moved to the crane controls, her hands flying over switches and levers with practiced familiarity. I operated these cranes for 2 years. I know exactly what they can do. Before Jong-jae could stop her, she activated one of the massive machines. The crane roared to life, its mechanical arms swinging out over the warehouse floor. Men scattered as it moved, the heavy hook sweeping through the space like a pendulum. "Jennifer, what are you doing?" "Changing the rules." She manipulated the controls with precision, using the crane to herd Min's men toward the exits, creating chaos and confusion without actually harming anyone. It was masterful, a display of control and power that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with understanding systems and how to manipulate them. Min saw what was happening and made a desperate decision. He grabbed one of the fallen weapons and aimed it not at Zhang but at the control room. At Jennifer. "No!" Zhang threw himself in front of the window just as Min fired. The bullet shattered glass and caught Zhang in the shoulder. Spinning him around, he hit the floor hard, pain exploding through his body. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Jennifer scream his name. But he was still conscious, still aware. And through the broken window, he could see Min advancing, his weapon raised, his face showing nothing but cold determination to finish what he'd started. Jennifer grabbed a heavy wrench from the control panel and stood over Zhang body, her stance protective and fierce. "Come up here." She called down to Min. "Come try to hurt him again. I dare you." For a moment, Min actually hesitated. This janitor, this woman he'd dismissed as nobody, stood between him and his goal with nothing but a wrench and pure determination. It should have been laughable. Instead, it was somehow terrifying. Park appeared behind Min, his weapon pressed against the back of Min's head. "It's over," he said quietly. "Your men are gone. You're alone. Put down the gun." Min's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him as he realized he'd lost. Not just the battle, but everything. His coup had failed, his bid for power had crumbled, and he'd been stopped not by armies or tactics, but by the very people he dismissed as beneath notice. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone had called the authorities, and there was no way to explain away what had happened here. Min would face justice, real justice, not the kind his money and connections usually bought him. As Park secured Min and the remaining guards, Jennifer knelt beside Zhang, examining his new wound with shaking hands. "You're going to need a real hospital this time," she said, her voice trying for levity but breaking halfway through. "Worth it," Zhang managed, his hand finding hers. "You're worth it." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "You absolute fool. You could have died. But I didn't, because you were there." Zhang squeezed her hand gently. "You saved me. Again." The police arrived minutes later, along with ambulances and what seemed like half the city's emergency services. The story that emerged was complicated. Organized crime, betrayal, violence. But it was also a story about ordinary people standing up to corruption, about loyalty and courage, and the power of refusing to be invisible. In the hospital 3 days later, Zhang woke to find Jennifer sitting beside his bed. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, but she smiled when she saw him conscious. "The doctors say you'll recover," she said. "Both wounds are healing cleanly. No permanent damage except some impressive scars." And Min? In custody. They're building a case that should keep him locked up for the rest of his life. Turns out when you give people a reason to speak up, they have a lot to say about years of exploitation and abuse. Zhang nodded, then looked at her seriously. "Your family's debt. The ledger I burned." "I know. I went home and found the ashes." Jennifer's expression was complicated. "That was years of documentation. We might need it for legal proceedings. I have copies, digital records of everything, but the physical proof of shame, that needed to burn. Your family shouldn't carry that burden anymore." "We still owe the money." "No." Zhang voice was firm. "The debt is cleared. I'm using what remains of my resources to nullify all predatory loans the organization issued. Every family trapped like yours, they're free. It won't undo the damage, but it's a start." Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. "What happens to you now, to your empire? I don't want it back. Not the way it was." Zhang looked out the hospital window at the city beyond. "I spent 15 years building something that crushed people to make profit. I told myself it was just business, that I was no worse than anyone else, but I was wrong." He turned back to Jennifer. "You showed me that. You, with your small apartment and your honest work and your refusal to let the world make you invisible. You have more real power than I ever did with all my money and influence, because your power comes from integrity, from choosing to do right even when it's hard. So what will you do? Something different, something better." Zhang expression was thoughtful. "The organization's assets, the legitimate ones, I'm restructuring them, creating a foundation to help families trapped by predatory lending, funding education programs, supporting workers' rights. It won't erase what I did, but maybe it can start to balance the scales. Jennifer smiled, real warmth in her eyes. That sounds like a good use of dragon power. Over the following weeks, the city began to change. News stories emerged about families having their debts forgiven, about workers organizing for better conditions, about a former criminal empire being dismantled and rebuilt into something that actually helped people rather than exploiting them. It wasn't perfect. There was resistance, legal challenges, people who wanted to maintain the old systems, but slowly, steadily, change took root. Jennifer continued working as a janitor, but now she also sat on the foundation's board of directors. Her understanding of what working people actually needed was invaluable in shaping programs that made real differences. She took up space now, unafraid to speak up, to challenge, to demand better. Jong-jae worked alongside her, learning humility and patience. He used his knowledge of how systems of exploitation worked to dismantle them from within. It was harder work than building an empire had been, and less lucrative, but infinitely more meaningful. 6 months after the warehouse confrontation, they stood together at the opening of a community center funded by the foundation. It occupied the building where Jong-jae's penthouse used to be. He'd sold it and used the money for this instead. The center offered legal aid, job training, childcare, all the services that people like Jennifer's family had desperately needed. "Your mother came to the opening," Jennifer said, watching families explore the new space. "She said to tell you thank you. Her medical debt is cleared and she's getting the treatment she needs." "It's the least I could do." Jong-jae watched a group of children playing in the newly created library, their laughter echoing through the halls that used to hold only cold ambition. This is what power should look like. Not control, service. Jennifer slipped her hand into his. "You know people are going to write about this. The Mafia boss who became a philanthropist. They'll make it into a redemption story. Is that what this is? I don't know." Jennifer looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "I think it's more complicated than that. Redemption implies earning forgiveness, but I think what you're doing is just growing, becoming someone new, learning to use your gifts for building instead of destroying. Because of you." "No." Jennifer squeezed his hand. "Because you chose to. I just showed you it was possible. The decision was always yours." They stood together, watching the community center fill with life and hope and possibility. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, full of people struggling and surviving, and occasionally, if they were lucky, thriving. Jong-jae had learned that real power wasn't about being feared or obeyed.